Starting bright and early on a Monday morning, and we know that in Paris, the Indian Paralympic team has just wrapped up their most successful campaign ever at the 2024 Games. They've brought home a stunning 29 medals, 7 gold, 9 silver and 13 bronze. The last few days have been filled with incredible images. You'll remember, and you can see that on your screens, there was a 13-year-old Sheetal Devi's visuals who went viral. She had that perfect bullseye and her steely concentration as she was in those last few minutes just zoning in. There was Navdeep Singh's gold-clinching javelin throw and that stomach-churning moment right before it.
But as we celebrate their success, let's also sort of ask an important question to ourselves. How accessible is our country for our heroes once they return home? Now, while India is making strides, there are still significant hurdles. Only 6% of buses are fully accessible for wheelchair users. Train stations remain a challenge due to steps and bridges. With 1 in 3 persons with disability living in our cities, today on the show, we thought we'll get right into the question and ask the elephant in the room. How can we make our infrastructure and our day-to-day life more inclusive? Not just celebrate these athletes on the podium, but even on the streets.
Right, so in the last few years, you have had some innovative solutions enter into the public arena. You have, for example, Fifth Sense, Inclu Maps, Accessible, My Udan. These are all initiatives that are paving the way for a more independent living. But the change goes beyond just mobility, even though that itself is an area that's not entirely solved. You also have aspects like representation, for example, and we thought this number was stunning. Did you know that there was only one candidate with a disability across parties, and this is obviously a known candidate with a disability, in the entire 2024 general elections? So to explore how we can build and create a truly accessible India, we have with us on the show this morning disability rights activist Nipun Malhotra. He's with us here. Nipun is the founder of Nipman Foundation. He's also the founder chair of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industries Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. That's quite a title on empowering persons with disabilities. Nipun, can we just start off bright and early on this Monday morning by asking you, if you had to give India a ranking of sorts, just tell us where it stands right now. When you look globally at different countries, how much they've made themselves accessible infrastructurally over the last few years, where does India stand?
So I think the glass is both half full and half empty in that sense. India, of course, has a long way to go when it comes to accessibility. I mean, if you go to Europe or the United States of America, you can't even find a single Starbucks that does not really have a ramp, etc., because accessibility is such a strong mandate there. Having said that, in India, there have been some developments over the last few years. In 2015, the government announced the Accessible India campaign. In 2016, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 came up. These are laws that are very strong on paper. These actually mandate accessibility. Today, according to law, every public infrastructure in this country has to be made accessible in that sense. The problem in India actually is more of implementation than really the laws on paper. And I think that is the big challenge that we really need to work on in the coming years.
Okay.
I see. Nipun, you've been somebody who's been working on this issue. You've been a spokesperson. You've even knocked the doors of Supreme Court several times for representation and all of it. But I want to understand this from you. On one hand, when you see such a massive sort of victory and medals coming in India's way, does it speak of the infrastructure on the whole that has developed as well?
Yes, in a way it does. I mean, in 2012, India had won just 1 medal in the Paralympics. I think we've come a long way from there. And I think what also happens when a country starts progressing in terms of medals in Paralympics is that there are role models that come up for people with disabilities. Today, if there's a young girl at home in a village, she will be told by her parents, that, Deepa Malik could do this, Sheetal Devi could do this, Mansi Joshi could do this. You can do this as well.
Yeah.
And I think that is something which is extremely important. If one goes through the stories of all these para-athletes in this country, the one common trend amongst all of them is that there have been a lot of sacrifices from their parents in that sense. It's really the story of at least one of the parents who's done a lot as well, as much as the Paralympian. So yes, I think these aspirational role models have played a big role. But at the same time, when you're talking about, infrastructure for parasports, I don't know there are how many schools in even a city like Delhi today really have the infrastructure to support para sports. It's more of the family influence that is really leading to these para sports persons achieving in life. It's great that the government has started supporting a bit now. There are big cash awards that have come for medalists. There are private sector companies that are funding them in sector as well. But I think there's still a lot more needs to be done for institutional change when it comes to para sports in this country.
Nipun, before we get to asking you a little bit about what you think needs to be done, I just want to ask you because, and I just want to share this with our audiences, you've been a disability rights activist for many, many years now. So you can maybe speak to the next question I ask you, which is when you do try to advocate for change, and this is something you do across the country, what have you found? Are there groups of people that are very, very open to this idea? Who are those people? Are there certain regions that are more open to it? More organizations? Just tell us a little bit more about what your experience has been.
I think attitudes have slowly started changing. I mean, of course, in India, there is still a big social stigma around disability. Just a couple of months back, I was at a market in South Delhi where somebody came up to me and asked, told me that it's really unfortunate that I'm a person with a disability, but he then went on to say that perhaps you've done some bad karma in your past life that is getting corrected with this disability. And if that wasn't enough, he actually asked me that, do you have a sibling? And I said, I have a younger brother. So he said, okay, I'm glad at least your parents have some hope if you have a younger brother who is not a person with a disability. So those challenges remain. But at the same time, I think a lot of awareness has started coming in. I mean, people like you in the media have started covering disability a lot more, there are more stories, there are more role models with persons with disabilities. We have a strong law that can be used as a weapon to create the kind of change that is required in that sense. There's a very active Department of Disability Affairs in the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment today, which is talking a lot about disability in that sense as well. So yes, there are positive changes, and it's all about finding allies everywhere really, right? From ministries in the government to CEOs in the private sector who are passionate about disability and through whom change can happen. And I often, say that 7 to 8% of India's population is disabled as per most estimates. At least 7 to 8, in fact. WHO says that 16%
to find a number on that,
of the world's population is persons with disabilities. And really, if we keep such a huge population behind, India cannot become the economic superpower that it wants to become. So it's not really charity when we are including persons with disabilities. It's a necessity to reach the next step in our dream.
Nipun, firstly, kudos to you having taken that with a chin up, those comments like these, and I'm sure these come to you, these come to everybody else who's, who is specially abled, as we like to say, and facing it every day. So kudos to that. But is it then boiling down to the key question of representation? When you have a DM of Noida who has a disability, when you have the Chief Justice of India talk about how he's going to revamp the entire Supreme Court premises to make it disabled friendly, are these then the steps that will make sure that we become a more inclusive society and work on our infrastructure?
Absolutely. And Sonal, before that, I would just like to correct you on one small thing. The UN recognized word is persons with disabilities. And I think for this country to move forward, we actually need to move away from euphemisms like specially abled and differently abled, I often joke that everybody in this world is specially abled in some way. Somebody might be a good singer, somebody might be a good anchor, somebody might be a good writer, and a fourth person might be good at something else. And, once we accept the term persons with disabilities and we accept people for what they are, it's only then that we can really create the right change. So I think that is something that I really hope for. Yeah. And at the same time, I think, yes, the infrastructure, you mentioned infrastructure change. I'm going to give you an interesting example when it comes to infrastructure change as well. Today, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 actually mandates that all public infrastructure needs to be made accessible. At the same time, the building bylaws that are operating in every state in this country do not have the accessibility guidelines incorporated into them. So when the government, Babu, goes to give a completion certificate for a particular building, they are going to look at the building bylaws and give a completion certificate. But tomorrow I can sue that particular building because it violates the RPWD Act. So I think what also needs to happen is a lot of harmonization of laws in that sense ready for the country to become accessible. I think you also mentioned representation. That was the second part of your question. I'm not sure. Yeah, in terms of representation, as Soya said in the introduction as well, it was unfortunate that there was just one candidate with a disability across political parties in India. I often say that disability, unlike other minorities, is something which is a horizontal identity. Vertical identities are identities that pass down from one generation to the other, whether it's caste or religion, which is why political parties often don't realize how big a minority it is, because it doesn't get ghettoized in particular regions. But at the same time, because of the sheer size of the disabled population, political parties need to realize that if they start having disability cells, they're going to have a huge first mover advantage when it comes to disability. I said 7 to 8% of India's population is disabled. At the same time, if you start attracting disabled voters, you're not just attracting the disabled voter, but you're attracting their entire family as well, which could easily be around 30% of this country. And more than that, since you are mentioning accessibility, accessibility is not just going to help somebody like me, it's going to help everybody, because we are all temporarily able-bodied. Today, anybody is really a fracture or an injury away from from facing the same accessibility challenges as I have. Other than that, I'm sure a lot of your viewers have an elderly parent or grandparent at home, or perhaps an elderly parent or grandparent is watching this show at home. And after a certain age, our knees start giving way. We start losing eyesight. We start losing the ability to hear. Don't we then have the same accessibility challenges that persons with disabilities have too? So when you're investing in disability, you're not really investing for persons with disabilities, but we're investing for everybody else. And I think that is the mantra that we need to follow.
Nipun, that's beautifully said. Can I ask you something? For our audiences who are watching right now, you touched on, for example, the fact that there are probably a lot of older people watching the show. But for everyone watching, I want to ask you, if audiences asked you, what should our takeaway be? How can we engage in the spaces around us, make sure they are accessible? And I don't just mean mobility. We've talked a lot about mobility today, but in the different ways, what would you actually suggest? Because it often feels like koi aur kar lega. What would you suggest?
No, I think that's a great point you said when you said not just mobility. Because when we talk about accessibility, and this often happens in conversations around accessibility in India, we're only talking about physical accessibility. Digital accessibility is another big challenge that persons with disabilities face too. I mean, today, for example, if you look at websites, are they really accessible to the blind? There are a lot of people who are on social media. You put images up every day. Are we putting up image descriptions or all text? Every social media app, if you notice closely, has that option. That really makes the image accessible to a person who is blind in that sense. And apart from that, I think an attitudinal shift also really, needs to happen. Are we working on making our own houses accessible? If we make our own houses accessible, tomorrow it's only going to help us if we get an injury or something. Are we working on making our own offices accessible? And apart from that, how are we really treating people around us? In the end, we really need to realize that this country is diverse. And I think the beauty of this country is that it's diverse. So really treating people equally for their abilities and not their disabilities across gender, caste, religion, sexuality and disability. That's what's really going to make this country a beautiful country to live in.
Okay.
That's really nice. Nipun, then tell me this, that if we were to put you in charge of fixing all the problems for a day, if Nipun were to be sitting in a powerful chair today and say that this is what needs to be done for inclusiveness, for ensuring that the world that we live in is more caring, is more adaptive and is more receptive of the disabled people, what would you do? Tell me one thing that you will change.
I think I would like to integrate disability more in society in that sense. For example, in schools today, we have environment education, we have gender education. Why don't we have disability education at the same time? That would ensure that every student who's coming out of school is more sensitive. We have NGOs that are doing accessibility audits, universal design, etc. Why are all architecture students not taught universal design and accessibility? Why is the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act not taught in law school so that all lawyers are not trained on disability in that sense? So I think education in that sense can play a major role. Secondly, I praise the Department of Disability Affairs, but at the same time, why do we need a separate Department of Disability Affairs? Why doesn't every ministry have a nodal officer with respect to disability? Because disability is such an intersectional issue, right? It affects housing, education, sports, everything. So I think that is something else that would be something which is extremely important as well. But I think the challenge is very big. On my first day, I would pass an order that give me 5 years to solve the problem instead.
It's like a genie who asks for more wishes. Can we ask you, Nipun, lastly, and Sonal touched on this when she was asking you one of her questions, the work you've done in the Supreme Court when it comes to the portrayal of those with disabilities in film. I just want to ask you there, because it's a tricky question. Tell us, A, what have your issues been to the way in which it's been portrayed on film? And then tell us examples of where it's done beautifully, because I really want our audiences to leave this talk with actual concrete takeaways.
Right. So I'd gone to the Supreme Court earlier this year. I'll give you a brief background. I went to the Supreme Court against this movie called Aak Micholi, which had released late last year, which showed people with disabilities in a very negative way. It really lampooned and laughed at disability. For example, there's somebody who had a memory problem who was called a Bulakkar Baap. Somebody who had speaking issues was called an Atki Cassette. Night blindness was portrayed in a totally fictional way in that sense. And the crux of this movie really was that if you are a person with a disability and you want to get married, the only way for you to succeed is to hide your disability. And I felt negative portrayal of people with disabilities can really, reinforce stereotypes that already exist in society around disability. And that's when I went to the Supreme Court. And when I went to the Supreme Court, my lawyers argued beautifully, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice asked me to speak as well. And the only point I said, and this is the point I said because I knew that a lot of my friends are going to ask me this as well, that do you really have a problem with humor, and are you trying to say that freedom of speech and expression should be stopped? So I made this differentiation, between humor that laughs at situations persons with disabilities face, which is perfectly acceptable because actually that helps in highlighting the challenges people with disabilities face, but laughing at disability itself is something which is extremely wrong. And unfortunately in India, that is something which is happening a lot. Where the disability itself is laughed at rather than situations people with disabilities face, which is very negative. I'm sure a lot of your viewers have seen Sholay, for example, right? There's that iconic scene where Gabbar cuts off Thakur's hands because he says that it's better to have no hands than to die. Is that really a reality? Are we trying to say that somebody like Sheetal Devi should not exist because she doesn't have hands? Clearly she proved Gabbar wrong, right? And this is what I wanted to prove wrong in all these movies as well. And that's why I went to the Supreme Court, and I'm delighted that the Supreme Court came out with guidelines on the portrayal of people with disabilities, not just in movies, but in all kinds of visual media. And I think that will play a major role in how people with disabilities are looked at in society.
Okay.
Yeah. Nipun, with you, and kudos to you and more power to you to keep at it. But one has to ask the question that what gives you strength to keep doing this every day? You've been at it for several years, if not decades, ensuring that you become a brand ambassador of sorts for disability. You have, like you said, taken to courts, gone and met politicians, addressed forums. You're a TED Talk speaker, you're a motivational speaker as well. What keeps you going?
When I was born, doctors, I was born with fractures in my arms and legs. This was pre any disability legislation in India. And doctors actually told my parents that Nipun is going to live the life equivalent of a wooden doll. But I was lucky because my mother decided to really look at my abilities and not my disabilities, sent me to a normal school, and life went uphill from there. But I think there are many others who don't really have that opportunity or the privilege. And I really want to fight for them so that they can have that same equality without that opportunity as well. And I think the joy that I really get is whenever there's a person with a disability who can benefit from any of the work that I can do. And I think it's really the independence that I can give people with disabilities that really keeps me moving.
Nipun, thank you. At every single point, the points you've made have just moved us. I hope for our audiences too, this has provided an inspiring start for their Monday mornings. Thank you so much for joining us.